Every fighter who had rules made to stop them. The Gracie family broke mixed martial arts before it even had rules. When Royce Gracie stepped into the octagon at UFC 1 in 1993, he wasn't just representing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He was about to expose the biggest lie in martial arts history. At 175 pounds, wearing a traditional GI, he looked like he'd wandered into the wrong building. His first opponent, Art Jimerson, was a professional boxer who literally wore one boxing glove, convinced he'd knock out this skinny Brazilian in seconds. Instead, Royce took him down, mounted him, and forced a submission so effortlessly that Jimerson tapped out of pure confusion. Then he did it again to Ken Shamrock, a 220-pound beast who looked like he could bench press a car. And again to Gerard Gordeau in the finals, a 260-pound Savate champion who'd been kicking people's heads off all night. The Gracies had just proven that 90% of martial artists had no idea how to fight on the ground. They'd spent decades perfecting techniques in their garage in Brazil, testing them against anyone brave enough to step on their mats. While other martial artists were breaking boards and performing kata, the Gracies were choking out challengers in real fights. The impact was seismic. Suddenly, every martial artist in the world realized they were incomplete. Wrestling programs exploded. Jiu-jitsu schools opened on every corner. The UFC had to completely restructure their rules because fights were ending too quickly with submissions most people had never seen before. But here's the kicker. Royce wasn't even the best fighter in his family. His brothers, Rickson and Rolls, were considered superior, but they chose Royce specifically because he was the smallest. They wanted to prove that technique could overcome size and strength so dramatically that no one could argue it was just about athleticism. Maurice Smith forced kickboxing to ban the clinch. Maurice Smith was supposed to be easy money for Muay Thai champions in the 1980s. He was an American kickboxer fighting in Thailand, where foreigners typically got destroyed by fighters who'd been throwing elbows since they could walk. Instead, Smith developed something that made Thai promoters panic. The most devastating clinch game a non-Thai had ever possessed. Traditional kickboxing rules allowed limited clinching, just enough for a quick knee or throw before the referee separated fighters. Smith turned those few seconds into a weapon of mass destruction. He'd grab opponents, drive knees into their ribs and liver, then toss them to the canvas like rag dolls. His clinch work was so violent that Thai fighters, masters of the clinch themselves, couldn't match his strength and technique. The problem wasn't just that Smith was winning, it was how he was winning. He'd grab fighters and systematically break them down in the clinch, landing knees that folded opponents in half. His victories were so one-sided that promoters realized they had a serious problem. If other foreign fighters learned Smith's clinch system, traditional kickboxing would become unwatchable. So they changed the rules. New regulations severely limited clinch time, required immediate separation after any grab, and essentially neutered the technique that made Smith unstoppable. They literally rewrote kickboxing to stop one man from dominating their sport. Anderson Silva made the UFC ban showboating. Anderson Silva didn't just fight, he performed. For 7 years, he turned the octagon into his personal theater, taunting opponents with his hands down, dodging punches by millimeters, and landing strikes that looked like they belonged in a martial arts movie. His performance against Forrest Griffin was so dominant, it looked fake. Silva slipped every punch, countered with surgical precision, and dropped Griffin with what appeared to be a love tap. But Silva's showboating reached its peak against Demian Maia at UFC 112. For 25 minutes, Silva danced, taunted, and refused to engage seriously with a world-class grappler who couldn't get close enough to threaten him. Silva would drop his hands, invite Maia forward, then slip away at the last second. He threw kicks while looking at the crowd, blew kisses to fans, and generally treated the fight like a sparring session. The crowd booed. Dana White was furious. The media called it disrespectful. Silva had crossed the line from entertaining showmanship to outright mockery of his opponent, and the sport itself. The UFC's response was swift and decisive. They implemented new rules about timidity and engaging with the opponent. Fighters could no longer simply avoid engagement for extended periods. Referees were given more authority to penalize fighters who weren't actively trying to finish fights. The athletic commissions backed these changes, essentially creating anti-Silva legislation. Fedor Emelianenko broke PRIDE's heavyweight division. Fedor Emelianenko was the most feared man in mixed martial arts, and Pride Fighting Championships built their entire heavyweight division around trying to find someone, anyone, who could beat him. The problem was that Fedor made elite heavyweights look like amateurs, and he did it with a style so unorthodox that opponents couldn't prepare for it. Standing 6 feet tall in a division full of giants, Fedor compensated with the fastest hands in heavyweight history and ground skills that defied physics. He'd stand toe-to-toe with kickboxers and outstrike them, then take down Olympic wrestlers and submit them. Against Mirko Krokop Filipovic, one of the most feared strikers in MMA, Fedor walked through leg kicks that had hospitalized other fighters and landed combinations that left Krokop stunned, but it was his comeback ability that truly broke opponents' spirits. Against Kazuyuki Fujita, Fedor got dropped by a massive right hand that would have ended most careers. Instead of covering up or trying to recover, Fedor immediately exploded back to his feet and knocked Fujita unconscious with a counterpunch. Against Brett Rogers, the same pattern. Dropped early, back up instantly, finish with extreme prejudice. Pride's matchmakers became increasingly desperate. They brought in the biggest, strongest, most technical fighters they could find. Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, the greatest heavyweight grappler of his era, got submitted. Mark Hunt, a K1 champion with knockout power in both hands, got dominated on the ground. Kevin Randleman, an NCAA wrestling champion with freakish athleticism, got slammed on his head and still lost. Hit the like button with everything you've got. These rule changes shaped combat sports forever. Royce Gracie forced the UFC to create weight classes. After Royce Gracie won 3 of the first 4 UFC tournaments, the organization faced an existential crisis. The entire premise of the UFC was to determine which martial art was superior, but Gracie had already answered that question definitively. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu wasn't just effective, it was so dominant that size and strength became irrelevant. The problem was that Royce's continued dominance was making the UFC predictable. Fans were tuning in to watch him submit much larger opponents, but the novelty was wearing off. Worse, other fighters were refusing to compete because they knew they'd lose to superior grappling. The talent pool was shrinking, and the sport was in danger of becoming a Brazilian jiu-jitsu exhibition. UFC matchmakers tried everything. They brought in bigger wrestlers, more experienced strikers, and fighters with legitimate martial arts credentials. Dan Severn, a 2-time NCAA wrestling champion, lasted longer than most, but still got submitted. Ken Shamrock, who had legitimate submission skills, couldn't match Royce's technique and composure. The solution was revolutionary: weight classes. By UFC 12, the organization had implemented heavyweight and lightweight divisions, forcing fighters to compete against opponents of similar size. This change didn't just level the playing field, it fundamentally altered the sport's evolution. Suddenly, technique had to be combined with athleticism. Fighters could no longer rely solely on one martial art because their opponents would be equally sized and potentially equally skilled. The era of style versus style was over, replaced by the modern mixed martial arts we know. Don Frye made Pride ban mustaches. Just kidding, but he should have. Don Frye didn't just fight, he embodied everything American about mixed martial arts, complete with a mustache that belonged in a 1970s action movie and a fighting style that can only be described as controlled violence. In Pride's heavyweight division, where technical strikers and submission specialists reigned supreme, Frye brought something completely different: old-school American toughness wrapped in surgical precision. His most famous moment came against Yoshihiro Takayama at Pride 21, in what became known as the greatest standing exchange in MMA history. For nearly 2 minutes, both men stood in the pocket and threw bombs at each other's faces. No movement, no defense, just pure will and devastating punches. Fry's mustache never moved, his expression never changed, and when Takayama finally fell, Fry looked like he'd just finished a light sparring session. But Fry's real weapon wasn't his mustache or his toughness. It was his ground and pound. He pioneered a style of top control that was both brutal and technical. Once he got on top, he'd posture up and rain down punches with the precision of a surgeon and the power of a sledgehammer. His elbows were particularly devastating, cutting opponents and forcing stoppages that looked more like car accidents than fights. Pride officials never officially banned mustaches, but they did implement new rules about ground striking after Fry's dominance. Restrictions on elbow strikes, changes to referee positioning, and modifications to scoring all came partly in response to fighters like Fry, who had turned ground control into an art form of systematic destruction. Kazushi Sakuraba forced Pride to limit fight duration. Kazushi Sakuraba earned the nickname the Gracie Hunter by doing something no one thought possible, systematically defeating members of the most dominant family in mixed martial arts. But Sakuraba's victories weren't just impressive. They were so methodical and time-consuming that Pride had to change their entire tournament structure to accommodate his fighting style. Sakuraba's approach was unlike anything the Gracies had faced. Instead of trying to avoid their ground game or overpower them with strength, he met them on the mat and outgrappled them using catch wrestling and submission defense that seemed impossible. Against Royler Gracie, he spent 90 minutes, yes, 90 minutes, systematically breaking down one of the best grapplers in the world before finally securing a submission. The fight against Royce Gracie was even more extreme. With no time limits and no judges, both men fought for over an hour in a battle of pure attrition. Sakuraba's conditioning was superhuman, his technique was flawless, and his mental toughness was unbreakable. He eventually forced Royce's corner to throw in the towel, ending the myth of Gracie invincibility forever. But these marathon fights were creating serious problems for PRIDE. Television broadcasts couldn't accommodate fights that might last 2 hours. Fighters were suffering long-term damage from extended battles. The sport was becoming less about skill and more about who could survive the longest. Pride's solution was to implement time limits and rounds, fundamentally changing how mixed martial arts was contested. No longer could fighters engage in endless grappling exchanges. The sport became more dynamic, more television-friendly, and ultimately more sustainable for the athletes involved. Muhammad Ali made boxing ban the rope-a-dope. Muhammad Ali didn't just change boxing, he broke it. His rope-a-dope strategy against George Foreman in Zaire wasn't just brilliant tactics. It was so effective that boxing commissions worldwide had to rewrite their rules to prevent fighters from using the ropes as a defensive weapon. The Rumble in the Jungle showcased Ali's genius at its peak. Instead of dancing and moving like everyone expected, Ali leaned against the ropes and let Foreman punch himself into exhaustion. For 7 rounds, Foreman threw bombs while Ali covered up, absorbed punishment, and whispered psychological warfare into his opponent's ear. "Is that all you got, George? They told me you could hit." But Ali wasn't just surviving, he was studying. Every punch Foreman threw taught Ali something about his timing, his power, his stamina. By the 8th round, when Foreman was completely gassed, Ali exploded off the ropes and knocked out the most feared puncher in heavyweight history with a combination that seemed to come from nowhere. The problem was that other fighters started copying the strategy without Ali's defensive genius or psychological mastery. Boxers were getting seriously hurt, leaning on ropes, absorbing punishment they couldn't handle, and suffering long-term brain damage from accumulated shots. The rope-a-dope was becoming a recipe for disaster in the wrong hands. Boxing commissions responded by implementing new rules about excessive holding and using the ropes for support. Referees were instructed to break up fighters who leaned on the ropes for extended periods. The sport essentially legislated against Ali's most famous tactical innovation. Rickson Gracie made Vail Tudo implement medical suspensions. While his younger brother Royce was conquering the UFC, Rickson Gracie was doing something even more terrifying in Brazil's underground Vail Tudo scene. He was ending careers without throwing a single punch. His submission skills were so advanced and his application so precise that opponents were suffering injuries that kept them out of competition for months or even years. Rickson's approach to fighting was methodical and surgical. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to completely dominate his opponents mentally and physically. Against Ray Zulu, a massive capoeira fighter who outweighed him by 50 pounds, Rickson spent 20 minutes systematically breaking down his opponent's will before applying a choke so perfectly that Zulu was unconscious before he could tap. But it was his fight against Yuki Nakai that truly showcased the problem. Nakai, a Japanese fighter, suffered a detached retina during their bout, but continued fighting. Rickson, unaware of the injury, continued applying pressure and submissions that could have caused permanent blindness. Nakai never fought again, and the incident highlighted the need for better medical oversight in Vail Tudo. The Brazilian Vail Tudo organizations were forced to implement comprehensive medical examinations, mandatory suspension periods after submissions, and stricter referee training. Fighters could no longer compete immediately after being submitted or knocked unconscious. Medical professionals became mandatory at all events. Bas Rutten forced Pancrase to ban palm strikes. Bas Rutten arrived in Japan's Pancrase organization in 1993 with a weapon that nobody saw coming. Palm strikes that hit like sledgehammers wrapped in velvet gloves. While other fighters were throwing closed fist punches that often broke their hands on opponents' skulls, Rutten had perfected a technique that delivered devastating power while protecting his own hands from injury. Pancrase rules originally allowed palm strikes as a safer alternative to closed fist punching. The Japanese promoters thought palm strikes would be less damaging, more technical, and better suited to their hybrid wrestling submission format. They were catastrophically wrong about the less damaging part. Rutten's palm strikes were surgical instruments of destruction. He'd cup his hand slightly, creating a perfect striking surface that could generate tremendous force while distributing impact across a wider area. Against Masakatsu Funaki, one of Pancrase's founders, Rutten landed palm strikes that sounded like gunshots echoing through the arena. Funaki, a legitimate tough guy who'd never been hurt by traditional punches, was visibly rocked by strikes that looked almost gentle. The Dutch striker had studied the biomechanics obsessively. Palm strikes allowed him to generate power from different angles, strike through opponents' guards, and land shots that traditional boxers couldn't even attempt. His upward palm strikes were particularly devastating. He could drive them under opponents' chins or into their solar plexus with force that folded grown men in half. But Rutten's palm strikes created an unexpected problem. They were causing more damage than regular punches. The wider surface area meant more brain trauma from impacts. The cupped palm created a suction effect that could rupture eardrums. Fighters were suffering injuries that took months to heal, and medical professionals were baffled by the trauma patterns they were seeing. Pancrase officials initially tried to regulate palm strike technique, requiring fighters to keep their hands completely flat. When that didn't work, they implemented power restrictions. Finally, they banned palm strikes entirely, forcing fighters to use only open hand slaps or closed fist punches. Tank Abbott made the UFC implement drug testing. David Tank Abbott looked like he'd wandered out of a biker bar and accidentally stumbled into a cage fight. But his raw power and complete disregard for conventional training methods exposed a massive loophole in early UFC regulations. There was absolutely no drug testing, and Tank was taking full advantage of that oversight. Abbott's approach to fighting was beautifully simple. Walk forward, throw haymakers, and hope the other guy fell down first. He had no formal martial arts training, no conditioning program, and no game plan beyond hit hard and often. What he did have was freakish knockout power that could end fights with a single punch, and a lifestyle that would have killed most professional athletes. His knockout of John Matua at UFC 6 became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Abbott landed a right hand that left Matua unconscious and convulsing on the canvas, while Tank celebrated by drinking beer and smoking cigarettes at the after party. The image of an obviously intoxicated fighter partying immediately after potentially brain-damaging an opponent became a public relations nightmare for the UFC. But Tank's real impact on UFC policy came from his pre-fight preparation, or complete lack thereof. He would show up to fights having consumed alcohol within hours of competition, openly discussed his recreational drug use in interviews, and once famously claimed his training consisted entirely of bar fights and beer. Medical professionals were horrified that someone in his condition was being allowed to compete. The UFC's response was comprehensive drug testing protocols that became the foundation for modern MMA regulation. Fighters were required to submit to pre-fight medical examinations, post-fight drug screening, and comprehensive health evaluations. The days of showing up drunk to cage fights were officially over. Genki Sudo made Pride ban choreographed entrances. Genki Sudo didn't just fight. He created performance art that happened to involve punching people in the face. His entrances were elaborate productions featuring costume changes, choreographed dance routines, and theatrical elements that turned Pride events into something between a martial arts tournament and a Broadway show. Sudo's most famous entrance involved him dressing as a traditional Japanese samurai, complete with full armor and ceremonial sword, before stripping down to reveal a futuristic silver outfit underneath. He would then perform a complex dance routine that incorporated martial arts movements, breakdancing, and interpretive dance, while his opponent stood in the ring wondering what exactly was happening. But Sudo's entrances weren't just entertainment. They were psychological warfare disguised as art. Opponents would spend 10 to 15 minutes watching this elaborate performance, losing focus, getting confused about whether they were in a fight or attending a concert. By the time Sudo actually entered the ring, his opponents were mentally off balance and unsure how to approach someone who seemed to exist in a completely different reality. The problem was that other fighters started copying Sudo's approach without his artistic vision or execution. Pride events began featuring increasingly elaborate entrances that took longer than the actual fights. Television broadcasts were being dominated by costume changes and dance routines rather than martial arts competition. So here's my question for you. Which of these rule changes do you think had the biggest impact on combat sports? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Smash that subscribe button if you want more deep dives into fighting history, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest breakdowns. Thanks for watching Fighting Explained, where we break down the stories that shaped the world of combat sports.